This evening we're going to take up our study of some of the one another texts in the New Testament. These are the Lord's prescription for our life together as the church. These texts tell us how he wants us to treat each other in light of the gospel. We can think of these one another texts as explaining how the gospel is lived out in our relationships. So far we've looked at 4 of these one another texts. Greet one another with a holy kiss, bear with one another, encourage one another, and receive one another. To get to the text we're going to think about this evening, I'm going to begin in the Old Testament and in the law that God gave to Israel at Mount Sinai. And when I show you the first verse, some of you might figure out where we're going. And if you do, just keep it to yourself. You can let me know afterwards if you worked it out. First of all, a verse from Exodus chapter 23, one of the commandments God gave to his people. Exodus chapter 22, verse 21. It says, "Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." In this context, a stranger was someone who was not an Israelite. A stranger was a foreigner. So don't think of stranger danger. This is a word that refers to a foreigner. Now, they may have been passing through the land, or they might have lived in the land. In this second case, they were what we might call resident aliens, people who lived in Israel but who were not Hebrews, people who were not descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And the command here was very clear. God's people were not to vex the stranger. That is, they were not to mistreat him. This command is given again in the next chapter, Exodus chapter 23, verse 9. "Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger. For ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." The word oppress here means to afflict, or to force, or even to crush. The children of Israel were not to treat strangers badly. They were not to harass them, or rip them off, or make their lives miserable. And I love the reason the Lord gives. It's actually quite beautiful. "Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." Isn't that a lovely way of putting it? You know what it's like to be a stranger. That's what you were in Egypt. You know what it's like in your heart. You know what it's like to feel different, to feel like you don't belong. That whole experience is very familiar to you. You didn't like it when you were treated badly. You didn't like being picked on or laughed at or exploited. You didn't like the prejudice and the scorn. You didn't like being nervous all the time about what they might do to you. So don't treat the strangers in your midst that way. But the Lord went further than this. It wasn't just a matter of not oppressing the stranger. The children of Israel were to treat strangers well. We see this in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34. "And if a stranger sojourn within your land, ye shall not vex him. But the stranger that dwelleth with you," this is a non-Israelite who lives in the land, "the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you. And thou shalt love him as thyself. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." And then this is repeated over in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 10, verse 19. "Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." And not just tolerate the stranger, but love him. And again, we have this reason at the end. "For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." We won't go into this tonight, but this command concerning the stranger was part of a collection of commands relating to vulnerable people. In the law, we see that God was very concerned about the welfare of the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and there with them were the strangers. And we can understand why strangers, foreigners, might have been vulnerable. Now, with this in mind, let's go over to the New Testament and to the one another text that we're going to think about this evening. It's in the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9. I'll put it up on the screen. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. And some of you have probably worked out the connection to what we've just looked at. Now, we use this word hospitality in a slightly different way than was intended by the New Testament writers. Hospitality in our culture is a general word or concept that refers mainly to the provision of food and drink. We talk about the hospitality industry, and that usually means the services provided by pubs, clubs, restaurants, and cafes. And when we talk about showing hospitality, it basically means having people over for a meal or maybe accommodating them for a night or two. But in the ancient world, it was a bit more specific than this. And we see this in the word itself, the word the Apostle Peter used when he penned this epistle. In the original language, hospitality is the word philoxenoi, which is made up of two words. Philos, which is one of the words for love. Affection is a good equivalent in English. And xenos, which is the word for a stranger. So philoxenoi, hospitality, is being friendly to strangers. One author defines it this way. A person who shows or uses hospitality is one who has an affectionate concern for strangers that expresses itself in offering them food and shelter. So, in a biblical sense, hospitality is not having your best friends over for a meal or having your friends from out of town stay for a couple of nights and looking after them. It's welcoming into your home people that you don't know so well. Maybe people you've only just met. Now, I won't give you a history lecture this evening, as enjoyable as that would be for you. But hospitality in this sense was much more important in the ancient world than it is today, because travel took a lot longer and was a lot more dangerous. It was in fact highly valued. And it's not without significance that in the Greco-Roman world, Zeus, the supposed father of the gods, was the protector of strangers. He was the god of hospitality. Peter's readers would have understood what he was talking about. They would have understood this cultural practice, and not just those from a Gentile background. The Jewish community highly valued hospitality as well. Now, what prompted Peter to put this exhortation into his letter, I don't know. We do know that the Christians he was writing to were being persecuted or were under threat of persecution, and perhaps that was making them reluctant to show hospitality. Maybe all of the issues associated with Jews and Gentiles coming together in the church was in Peter's mind. Those from a Jewish background were finding it difficult to show hospitality to their Gentile brothers and sisters, and vice versa. Perhaps Peter's readers were dealing with all of that baggage. I tend to think this was in the background for nearly all of the one another commands in the New Testament epistles, because this was such a big issue in the early church. These two groups that had been separated from each other for centuries were now in one body. They were now in one family. Or maybe Peter was simply addressing the general tendency to be self-centered. He knew his readers needed this reminder. Again, I don't know what prompted him, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to give this exhortation. but he did. And it's God's will for us. For all Christians, we are to use hospitality one to another without grudging. And in this little sermon, I'm going to share 4 thoughts about this, 4 headings. So here we go. Number 1, the Apostle Peter was urging Christians in local congregations to extend hospitality to each other. And while we recognise that the word hospitality refers to strangers, I think we can confidently say that Peter intended for his readers to welcome the people in their own church families into their homes. He does say, use hospitality one to another. It would be quite bizarre if Peter intended for his readers to receive strangers in their homes for meals and so forth, but not the people they went to church with every Sunday. I think we can say that the Lord Jesus would have us apply this command among ourselves. We are to welcome each other into our homes and encourage each other with meals and fellowship. This is to be a normal feature of our life together. And whenever I talk about this, I always say, if we're able. If we're able. Because some people, on account of age or illness or other life circumstances, can't do this. They are providentially hindered from showing hospitality. But most of us can. And we should. As I said, this is to be a normal feature of our life together. And it doesn't have to be a big production. It doesn't need to be a 3-course meal served on fine china. It doesn't have to be something weeks in the planning. The house doesn't need to be spotless. People don't care about that. Their house probably isn't that tidy either, especially if they have young children. It's the simple act of inviting people to come into your home to share a meal, no matter how basic it might be, and it means a lot. It goes a long way. This is one of the ways we show love to each other. This is how we care for each other, and we would all testify that it's a blessing. It's edifying to receive hospitality, to be invited to sit at someone else's table and have fellowship. It's very special. It warms the heart. Maybe there have been occasions when this was just the medicine for your soul. You were having a tough time, you were really struggling, and someone invited you over for Sunday lunch or for a barbecue on Saturday, and you had a wonderful time. It lifted your spirits. It was God pouring His grace, pouring His help into your life. This is one of the ways that we show love to each other, and I would add here that it's not just supposed to be for those we're closest to. Not just for our besties. No, it's good to entertain our closest friends, the people that we have a natural affinity with. But to show hospitality is also to open our homes to those we don't know so well. Maybe to people who've only just started coming to church. And actually, that is more in line with what the word means. So that's the first point for us to consider. But it does leave us with a question, and it's the one that I used to wrestle with when I came to this text. It's along these lines. And this is heading number 2. Yes, we are to apply this among ourselves, but if hospitality is having an affectionate concern for strangers, how do we show this to one another? Maybe you've wondered about this, or maybe it's just me, but this has to do with strangers, but we're supposed to show it to one another. How do we make sense of this? We're not strangers to each other, right? You see what I'm saying? It's a one another command, but it has to do with people we don't actually know. In my study this week, the penny finally dropped. The answer is found when we consider the context That is the context for this epistle. Who was Peter writing to? In chapter 1, verse 1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. He was writing to Christians who had been dispersed across what today is the country of Turkey. This is what we call a general epistle. It wasn't addressed to Christians who made up a local church in one particular town or city, like, for example, Paul's letter to the Philippians or his letter to the Thessalonians. These were actually the names of provinces: Pontus, Galatia, Bithynia. It would be a bit like saying to the strangers scattered throughout New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia. Or maybe, given that these provinces were probably smaller than our states, it would be like saying to the strangers scattered throughout the Tweed, the Northern Rivers, the Coffs Coast, the New England and the Northwest Slopes and Plains. Given the context, it becomes apparent that the one another command in our text was for all the Christians who lived in these provinces. They were to show hospitality to each other. So, for example, if Christians from Pontus were for some reason travelling to Bithynia, then the Christians in Bithynia were to show them hospitality. They might never have met them before. They were, for all intents and purposes, total strangers. But nevertheless, they were to welcome them into their homes and look after them. This is how this exhortation makes sense. This is how we have a one another command that applies to strangers. This is how we have a one another command that applies to people who aren't part of our local church family, to people we don't actually know or don't know yet. This has to do with the way all Christians are to treat each other. This goes beyond the local church to the larger church family. It reaches across suburbs and towns and states and even countries. Use hospitality one to another. To put it really simply, the apostle was urging his readers to open their homes to Christians they didn't know, to visitors. And this doesn't always come naturally, does it? Some of us are shy. Some of us are more guarded. Some of us aren't especially gregarious. It's kind of a big thing to invite people we don't know into our home. But this is what Christ is calling us to do. Any Christian brother or sister who turns up at our church should be welcome in our home for a meal. Maybe we need to be more serious about this. Maybe we need to ask for God's help to be open to opportunities to put this into practice. This is hospitality in the biblical sense, receiving strangers into our home. But as we think about this generally, we have to consider the second part of our text, and this is heading number 3. Peter says, show hospitality one to another without grudging. Now, the Greek word translated grudging is one of my favourites. It's the word gongusmos. Gongusmos. It's an onomatopoeic word. It's from that murmuring or muttering sound we make when we're cranky. Something like that. That murmuring under our breath. One scholar defines it this way: a muttering, murmuring, low and suppressed discourse, the expression of secret and sullen discontent, murmuring and complaint. This is complaining under your breath, grumbling. We all know what this is because our children have done it. And because we've done it too, we grown-ups. Now, why would Peter need to add this? Without grudging. Showing hospitality should be the easiest, most natural thing to do, right? And for some people it is. They seem to have a gift for this. They love having people over. A new person comes to church or a new family and they're inviting them over for lunch almost immediately. I always think of Steve's mum and dad. Okay, this is them. They've blessed dozens, probably hundreds of people this way. But for most of us, it's not easy. And sometimes we fulfill our obligation reluctantly. We have people over because we know we should, and then we complain about it afterwards. And to be frank, it's because we're self-centred. We didn't want to put ourselves out. We didn't want to interrupt the nice little life that we've got going. And then sometimes we complain because we feel like we're extending hospitality to others, but they're not extending it to us. That can become quite a sore point in a church family. But if that's what we're complaining about, then something isn't right when it comes to our motives. If it's about what we can get in return, then it's not genuine hospitality. I mean, think about it in the first century. You might have had those Christians come into your house who were travelling, and you might never see them again in your life. And so if we're doing this thinking about what we might get in return, then we haven't got it right. So, given the challenges, how do we do this? How do we, one, show hospitality one to another in our church family and to visitors? And then two, how do we show hospitality without complaining or grudging? Good questions. I want to leave you with one thought in this regard, one source of motivation. And it takes us back to where we started, back to what the Lord said to the children of Israel when He gave them the law. Here is something to help us show hospitality and to do so without grudging. Exodus chapter 23, verse 9, a verse I put on the screen earlier. Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger. Why were the children of Israel to treat strangers well? Because they knew what it was like to be a stranger. And so do we. We've all been the new person, or the person in the group that doesn't know everyone else very well. We've all been the person who's nervous about being in a situation where we don't know anyone. We've all been the person who is yearning for connection, for friendship. To use the words in the verse, we all know the heart of a stranger. We know how it feels. And shouldn't knowing that motivate us to reach out to strangers, to new people, to those who don't seem to have many connections in our church family? I think we can get so comfortable in our surroundings, so comfortable in our friendship group, that we forget about this. It's been so long since we were the stranger that we don't think about it. But if we did, if we remembered, it would make a real difference. We would look at the new people who come through the doors on a Sunday morning with different eyes, with a different attitude. This is one source of motivation, and I commend it to you. I'm sure this will help you put this one another command into practice. But there is something else we need to think about, and in truth, it ought to be a greater source of motivation, and with this I'll close. What we really need to remember is that Christ has welcomed us. Christ has opened His home to us. Christ has opened His heart to us. Thou preparest a table for me, David says of the Lord in Psalm 23. And this is true of all God's people. He receives us into his fellowship. He provides for us. He takes care of us. There is a sense in which his door is always open. There is always a seat for us at his table. If the Lord has been so hospitable to us, to we who were total strangers, to we who were far removed from him, then it's only fitting that we should extend hospitality to others. It really is the Christian thing to do. May God help us, and may he richly bless the preaching of his word. Amen.